The morning fog hung thick over the grounds of Balmoral Castle as Sergeant James Mackenzie adjusted his red tunic and checked his pocket watch. 23 years he had served the royal family, first under Queen Elizabeth II and now under King Charles III. His weathered hands, marked by decades of loyal service, trembled slightly as he polished the brass buttons on his uniform. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. James had started his royal service as a young man of 25, fresh from military training and eager to serve the crown. Back then, the Queen was in her prime, her presence commanding yet warm. She had a way of making even the most nervous guard feel at ease with a simple nod or a kind word. Over the years, James had witnessed countless moments of royal life, from grand state ceremonies to quiet family gatherings. He had become more than just a guard. He was a keeper of memories, a silent witness to history. The castle's ancient stones seemed to whisper stories of the past as James made his rounds. He remembered the day Princess Diana visited with young William and Harry, how the Queen's eyes lit up when she saw her grandsons racing through these very corridors. He recalled the somber atmosphere during times of crisis and the jubilant celebrations during royal weddings and anniversaries. Each memory was etched deep in his heart, particularly those involving the late Queen. Queen Elizabeth II had treated James with a respect that went beyond the typical royal servant relationship. She remembered his name, asked about his family, and once even sent flowers when his wife was ill. These small gestures meant the world to a man whose job required him to remain largely invisible. The Queen understood the sacrifice that came with royal service, the long hours away from family, the constant vigilance required to protect the monarchy. Among all his memories, one stood out with particular clarity. It was a crisp autumn day in 1987 when the Queen had decided to take her beloved Range Rover for a drive around the estate. James was assigned to accompany her, sitting in the passenger seat as she navigated the winding country roads with surprising skill. She spoke about the beauty of the Scottish landscape, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of her childhood visits to Balmoral. That Range Rover had become something of a legend among the royal staff. It was a 1974 model, forest green with tan leather interior, and the Queen drove it herself whenever possible. Unlike the formal state cars with their bulletproof glass and ceremonial flags, this Range Rover represented freedom for the monarch. It was her escape vehicle, her connection to a simpler life where she could be Elizabeth Windsor rather than Queen Elizabeth II. The vehicle had been modified over the years to accommodate the Queen's preferences. The seat was adjusted to her exact height, the mirrors positioned just right, and a special compartment installed for her personal items. James had helped with some of these modifications, working alongside the royal mechanics to ensure everything was perfect for Her Majesty. The car became as much a part of Balmoral as the castle itself. James remembered the Queen's excitement when she showed him the vehicle's special features. There was a hidden compartment where she kept emergency supplies, a radio system that could connect directly to the castle, and even a small cooler for drinks during long drives. She was particularly proud of the four-wheel drive capability, which allowed her to navigate the rougher terrain around the estate during her beloved country walks. Over the years, that Range Rover had been the Queen's companion through countless adventures. She used it to check on the estate's farming operations, to visit the local village, and sometimes simply to find a quiet spot where she could sit and think. James had accompanied her on many of these journeys, serving as both protector and companion. These drives became treasured moments of relative normalcy in a life governed by protocol and duty. The Queen's love for driving was well known among the staff, but few outsiders realized how skilled she was behind the wheel. She had learned to drive during World War II while serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and she maintained her abilities throughout her reign. The Range Rover represented this independent spirit, a reminder that beneath the crown and ceremony was a woman who valued freedom and adventure. James also remembered the Queen's mechanical curiosity about the vehicle. She would sometimes pop the hood and examine the engine, asking questions about maintenance and performance. Her knowledge impressed the mechanics, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty when necessary. This hands-on approach extended to many aspects of her life, from her prize-winning cattle to her beloved corgis. The Range Rover had weathered decades of Scottish seasons, from harsh winters when the Queen would navigate snowy roads with confidence, to glorious summers when she would drive with the windows down, enjoying the fresh Highland air. The vehicle's robust construction made it ideal for the estate's varied terrain, and the Queen took full advantage of its capabilities. As the years passed, The Range Rover required more maintenance, but the Queen refused to replace it. She had formed an emotional attachment to the vehicle that went beyond mere transportation. It represented her connection to Balmoral, to Scotland, and to the parts of her life that remained private and personal. The car held memories of conversations with family members, quiet moments of reflection, and the simple pleasure of driving through some of the most beautiful countryside in the world. James had been present during several memorable incidents involving the Range Rover. Once, when it broke down during a remote part of the estate, the Queen had walked back to the castle, treating the situation as an adventure rather than an inconvenience. Another time, when a group of tourists failed to recognize her and asked for directions, she cheerfully helped them while sitting in her Range Rover, amused by their assumption that she was simply a local resident. The vehicle had also been the Queen's refuge during difficult times. After the death of Princess Margaret, James had found her sitting quietly in the Range Rover, parked overlooking the loch. He had maintained a respectful distance, understanding that sometimes even monarchs needed solitude to process their grief. The car provided a private space where she could be vulnerable without the weight of royal expectations. Now, as James prepared for another day of service under King Charles III, he couldn't help but think about how different things had become since the Queen's passing. The new king had his own preferences, his own routines, and his own vision for the monarchy. Change was inevitable, but for someone who had devoted his life to serving the crown, adjustment came slowly and sometimes painfully. The morning's schedule indicated that King Charles would be touring the estate later, and James would be part of the security detail. These tours had become more frequent as the king worked to put his personal stamp on Balmoral, making changes that reflected his environmental concerns and architectural preferences. While James respected the king's vision, he sometimes felt that important connections to the past were being severed too quickly. As he walked through the castle's corridors, James noticed subtle changes everywhere. New paintings had replaced old favorites, furniture had been rearranged, and some of the Queen's personal touches had been quietly removed. Progress was necessary, he understood, but each change felt like losing another piece of the woman he had served so faithfully for more than 2 decades. The staff had been briefing about various estate matters recently, including discussions about vehicles and transportation. There had been talk of updating the royal fleet, replacing older vehicles with more modern, environmentally friendly alternatives. James understood the practical reasons behind such decisions, but he hoped certain vehicles with historical significance would be preserved rather than simply discarded. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor. A fellow guard approached with a message about the day's scheduled changes. As they spoke, James found himself glancing toward the garages where the estate's vehicles were kept. Somewhere in there sat the Queen's beloved Range Rover, probably gathering dust as newer vehicles took priority for royal use. The conversation with his colleague reminded James of how much the royal household had changed in recent months. New protocols were being established, different priorities were emerging, and long-standing traditions were being questioned. While he appreciated the king's desire to modernize the monarchy, James worried that important connections to the past might be lost in the process. As the morning progressed, James carried out his duties with the same professionalism he had maintained throughout his career. But beneath his composed exterior, emotions were stirring that he hadn't felt in years. The combination of changing times, cherished memories, and uncertainty about the future created a tension that seemed to build with each passing hour. When the call came that King Charles wanted to inspect the estate's vehicle inventory, James felt his pulse quicken. He had a feeling that this inspection would involve discussions about the Queen's Range Rover, and he wasn't sure he was emotionally prepared for what might be decided about the vehicle that held so many precious memories. Little did James know that this seemingly routine day would lead to a confrontation that would test every principle he had lived by during his years of royal service. The stage was being set for a moment when loyalty, memory, and duty would collide in ways he never could have imagined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as James Mackenzie made his way toward the estate's garage complex. His radio crackled with updates about King Charles's arrival for the vehicle inspection, scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. The royal garage housed an impressive collection of cars, from state vehicles used for official functions to more practical estate cars for daily use around Balmoral. But James knew that somewhere among them sat the Queen's Range Rover, and his chest tightened at the thought of what today might bring. The head of the royal household, Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, had briefed the staff earlier about the king's intentions to modernize the estate's transportation fleet. Hartwell was an efficient man in his 50s who had joined the royal service just 2 years before the Queen's death. Unlike James, he didn't carry the weight of decades-old memories, and his approach to royal service was decidedly more businesslike than sentimental. He spoke of efficiency, cost-effectiveness, and environmental responsibility as the driving factors behind the upcoming changes. During the briefing, Hartwell had mentioned specifically that several older vehicles would be evaluated for their continued usefulness. He spoke in the detached language of administration, referring to assets and inventory optimization. James had listened with growing unease, recognizing that the Queen's Range Rover would certainly fall under this scrutiny. The vehicle was, after all, nearly 50 years old and probably required expensive maintenance to keep running. As James entered the garage area, he was greeted by Tom Phillips, the chief mechanic who had maintained the royal vehicles for 15 years. Tom's weathered face showed the strain of recent weeks, and James could see that he too was worried about the impending inspection. They had worked together countless times, ensuring that every royal vehicle was in perfect condition for whatever service was required. Tom wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and gestured toward the far corner of the garage where the Queen's Range Rover sat beneath a protective cover. "Been thinking about her all morning," Tom said quietly. "Gave her a complete service just last month, runs like a dream despite her age. Seems wrong to just put her out to pasture, you know." James approached the covered vehicle and carefully lifted the tarp. The forest green paint still gleamed despite its age, and the chrome bumpers reflected the garage's fluorescent lights. The tan leather interior showed wear patterns that told the story of countless journeys across the Scottish countryside. Every scuff and mark represented a moment in the Queen's life, a memory that would be lost if the vehicle disappeared. The mechanic joined James beside the Range Rover, both men standing in respectful silence for a moment. Tom had maintained this vehicle with particular care over the years, understanding its special significance to the Queen. He knew every bolt, every wire, every component that made it function. More importantly, he understood what it had meant to the woman who drove it with such obvious joy and skill. "Remember when she brought it back with that dent in the rear quarter panel?" Tom asked with a slight smile. "Said she'd been avoiding a family of deer and caught a tree branch. Laughed about it like it was the greatest adventure she'd had in weeks. Most people would have been angry about the damage, but she was delighted by the story it gave her to tell." James remembered that incident well. The Queen had indeed been amused by her minor mishap, treating it as proof that the Range Rover was a proper working vehicle rather than a museum piece. She had insisted that the dent be repaired properly, not because she was concerned about appearances, but because she wanted the vehicle to remain in top condition for future adventures. The two men continued their examination of the vehicle, noting how well it had been preserved despite regular use. The Queen had been meticulous about maintenance, insisting that it receive the same level of care as the most important state vehicles. This attention to detail had kept it in remarkably good condition, a testament to both royal standards and Tom's skilled maintenance work. As they talked, other members of the garage staff began gathering nearby. Word had spread about the impending inspection, and everyone understood what it might mean for the Queen's beloved Range Rover. These men and women had all played roles in keeping the vehicle operational over the years, and they had witnessed firsthand how much it meant to their late monarch. Sarah Murphy, one of the younger mechanics, approached with obvious concern in her eyes. She had been mentored by Tom and had learned to maintain the Range Rover with the same dedication he had always shown. "Surely the king wouldn't get rid of it," she said hopefully. "It's part of royal history, isn't it? Like keeping Churchill's car or something similar." James wanted to share her optimism, but he had seen enough changes in recent months to know that sentiment rarely trumped practical considerations in the new royal administration. King Charles was focused on modernization and environmental responsibility, goals that didn't necessarily align with preserving vehicles simply because of their emotional significance. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and voices. Mr. Hartwell appeared at the garage entrance, accompanied by King Charles and several other officials. The king was dressed in country attire, looking every inch the gentleman farmer he had always aspired to be. His expression was businesslike as he surveyed the garage and its contents. James and the other staff members immediately stood at attention, following the protocols that had been drilled into them over years of royal service. The king acknowledged their presence with a brief nod before beginning his inspection of the vehicle collection. Hartwell provided commentary on each car, discussing maintenance costs, usage frequency, and environmental impact. As the inspection progressed, James found himself growing increasingly tense. The king examined several vehicles with obvious approval, particularly the newer hybrid models that aligned with his environmental values. He asked detailed questions about fuel efficiency, emissions, and maintenance schedules, clearly approaching the inspection from a practical rather than sentimental perspective. When the group finally reached the Queen's Range Rover, James felt his heart rate increase. King Charles paused before the vehicle, studying it with an expression that was difficult to read. Hartwell began reciting statistics about the car's age, maintenance costs, and fuel consumption, painting a picture of an outdated asset that consumed resources without providing significant value. "This particular vehicle has sentimental value, of course," Hartwell acknowledged diplomatically. "But from a practical standpoint, it represents exactly the kind of inefficiency we're trying to eliminate. The maintenance costs alone have been substantial, and the fuel consumption is quite poor by modern standards." The king listened to this assessment while walking around the Range Rover, occasionally touching its surface or peering through the windows. James watched anxiously, trying to gauge the royal reaction but finding it impossible to read the king's thoughts. Finally, King Charles spoke, and his words sent a chill through James's heart. "I think this old thing has served its purpose," the king said with casual dismissal. "Mother was certainly fond of it, but we can't let sentiment override practical considerations. The maintenance costs you've mentioned are simply too high for a vehicle that sees so little use these days." James felt something break inside him at those words. The casual dismissal of something so precious, the reduction of the Queen's beloved companion to this old thing, struck him like a physical blow. He had served the royal family faithfully for over 2 decades, maintaining his composure through countless challenges, but this felt like a betrayal of everything the Queen had represented. King Charles continued speaking, outlining his vision for a more modern, environmentally responsible vehicle fleet. He spoke about hybrid vehicles, electric alternatives, and the importance of setting an example for the nation. His arguments were logical and well-reasoned, but they completely ignored the emotional and historical significance of what he was proposing to discard. "In fact," the king added thoughtfully, "I rather fancy this Range Rover might suit my own needs perfectly. It's robust enough for estate work, and the 4-wheel drive would be useful. Perhaps we could transfer it to my personal collection rather than scrapping it entirely." The casual assumption that he could simply claim the Queen's most personal vehicle for his own use was more than James could bear. The idea that King Charles would drive the same roads the Queen had loved, sit in the same seat where she had found peace and freedom, seemed like a desecration of her memory. James felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. 23 years of disciplined service had taught him to suppress his emotions, to remain invisible and professional regardless of circumstances. But this moment tested every principle he had lived by during his royal career. The king's entourage began discussing practical arrangements for the vehicle transfer, treating the Range Rover as simply another asset to be redistributed according to royal convenience. Nobody seemed to understand or care about the emotional significance of what was being decided. For them, it was merely a matter of logistics and efficiency. As the inspection continued, James found himself remembering specific moments with the Queen in that very vehicle. He recalled her excitement when showing him new routes around the estate, her careful attention to the car's mechanical needs, and her obvious joy in the simple act of driving through the countryside she loved. Those memories felt precious and irreplaceable, and the thought of them being casually erased by royal convenience was almost unbearable. The final straw came when King Charles made an offhand comment about repainting the vehicle to better reflect his own tastes. The forest green that the Queen had specifically chosen, because it reminded her of the Scottish landscape, would be replaced with something more suited to the new king's preferences. Even this last connection to the Queen's personal choices would be eliminated. Something fundamental shifted inside James at that moment. The careful balance between duty and personal feeling that had sustained him through decades of service finally collapsed under the weight of what he was witnessing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would surprise everyone present, including James himself. The moment of explosion came without warning, like a dam finally giving way after years of accumulated pressure. James Mackenzie had spent 23 years perfecting the art of royal invisibility, standing at attention while momentous decisions were made around him, maintaining perfect composure regardless of his personal feelings. But as King Charles continued discussing his plans for the Queen's Range Rover with casual indifference, something inside James simply snapped. "With respect, Your Majesty," James heard himself saying, his voice cutting through the administrative chatter with surprising force. "That Range Rover doesn't belong to you." The garage fell silent as if someone had thrown a switch. King Charles turned slowly, his eyebrows raised in surprise at this unexpected interruption from a member of the staff. Mr. Hartwell's face went pale, and the other officials exchanged shocked glances. In the rigid hierarchy of royal service, guards simply did not challenge the monarch's decisions, regardless of their personal feelings about those decisions. James felt the eyes of everyone in the garage fixed upon him, but he found that he didn't care about protocol anymore. The emotional dam had burst, and years of suppressed feelings were pouring out in a torrent that he seemed powerless to control. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady as he continued speaking. "That vehicle belonged to Her late Majesty in a way that went far beyond mere ownership," James said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "She didn't just drive it, sir. She lived in it, found peace in it, used it to connect with the parts of herself that had nothing to do with being queen. It was her sanctuary, and now you want to take it like it's just another piece of furniture to be redistributed." King Charles stared at James with a mixture of surprise and growing displeasure. As the new monarch, he was still adjusting to the responsibilities and prerogatives of kingship, and this public challenge from a staff member was both unexpected and deeply inappropriate by royal standards. The silence in the garage stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited to see how the king would respond to this unprecedented breach of protocol. "Sergeant Mackenzie," Mr. Hartwell interjected desperately, using James's formal title in an attempt to remind him of his position and responsibilities. "I think perhaps we should discuss this matter privately later. His Majesty has many pressing matters to attend to today." But James was beyond caring about social conventions or career consequences. 23 years of bottled-up emotions had found their voice, and he was not going to be silenced by administrative diplomacy. He took a step forward, his military bearing evident despite the obvious emotion in his voice. "No, Mr. Hartwell, this needs to be said now," James replied firmly. "I've watched this family for more than 2 decades. I've seen the sacrifices, the loneliness, the moments when being royal felt more like a burden than a privilege. That Range Rover was one of the few things that belonged entirely to her, not to the crown, not to the institution, but to Elizabeth Windsor, the woman." King Charles's expression hardened as he listened to this extraordinary outburst. He had inherited not just a crown, but an entire system of relationships and traditions, and this public challenge from a servant threatened the very foundation of royal authority. His voice was cold when he finally spoke. "Sergeant Mackenzie, you are clearly overwrought and speaking out of turn. I suggest you return to your duties and we'll discuss this matter later through proper channels." The dismissive tone was exactly the wrong approach to take with a man whose emotional defenses had already crumbled. James felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. Here was the Queen's own son, treating her memory and her most precious possessions as inconvenient obstacles to his own plans. The disrespect felt like a personal attack on everything James had devoted his life to protecting. "Overwrought?" James repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, I think you're the one who doesn't understand what's happening here. Your mother drove that Range Rover through every season of her later life. She sat in that driver's seat when she needed to think, when she needed to remember who she was beneath all the ceremony and protocol." The other staff members watched in fascinated horror as their colleague continued his unprecedented confrontation with the king. Tom Phillips, the mechanic, looked like he wanted to intervene, but didn't know how, while Sarah Murphy stared with wide eyes at this violation of every rule they had been taught about royal service. James's voice took on a more personal tone as memories flooded back with painful clarity. "I remember the day she came back from driving after Prince Philip's funeral. She didn't say anything, just sat in that car for 20 minutes before going back into the castle. That Range Rover was where she went to grieve, to remember, to be human. And now you want to claim it like it's a trophy." King Charles's face flushed with anger at this public dressing down from a member of his staff. The other officials looked deeply uncomfortable, caught between their loyalty to the king and their recognition that James was speaking truths that perhaps needed to be heard. The confrontation had moved far beyond questions of vehicle ownership into dangerous territory involving royal authority and personal relationships. "How dare you presume to lecture me about my own mother's feelings?" the king said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I think you forget yourself, Sergeant. Your job is to provide security, not to offer unsolicited opinions about family matters that are frankly none of your concern." This dismissal only fueled James's anger further. The suggestion that the Queen's relationship with her staff was somehow superficial, that years of shared experiences meant nothing, felt like another insult to her memory. He had been more than just a security guard to the Queen. He had been a trusted companion, a keeper of confidences, a witness to her private moments of joy and sorrow. "None of my concern," James shot back, abandoning all pretense of deference. "I spent more time with your mother in that Range Rover than most members of her family did. I was there when she laughed at silly things during our drives, when she worried about the future of the monarchy, when she talked about her grandchildren with such love and pride. That vehicle holds memories that can never be replaced." The confrontation had attracted attention from other parts of the estate. Staff members were gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by the unprecedented sound of raised voices in the presence of the king. Word was spreading quickly through the castle that something extraordinary was happening in the garages, something that challenged the very foundations of how royal relationships were supposed to work. Mr. Hartwell made another attempt to defuse the situation, stepping partially between James and the king while maintaining a diplomatic tone. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could postpone this discussion until emotions have had a chance to settle. Sergeant Mackenzie is clearly devoted to the memory of her late Majesty, and that devotion sometimes manifests in unexpected ways." But King Charles was no longer interested in diplomatic solutions. The public nature of this confrontation, combined with James's continued defiance, had escalated the situation beyond simple staff management. This was now a matter of royal authority being challenged in front of witnesses, and that could not be allowed to stand without consequences. "Devotion?" the king repeated sarcastically. "This isn't devotion, Mr. Hartwell. This is insubordination of the highest order. Sergeant Mackenzie seems to have forgotten that he serves the crown, not his own sentimental attachments to the past." James felt something cold settle in his chest at those words. After more than 2 decades of faithful service, after countless hours of protecting and serving the royal family, he was being reduced to a simple employee who had overstepped his bounds. The dismissal of his relationship with the Queen as mere sentimental attachment felt like the final betrayal. "I served your mother," James said quietly, his voice carrying a new intensity that somehow seemed more threatening than his earlier raised voice. "I didn't serve the crown or the institution or any abstract concept. I served a woman who treated me with dignity and respect, who valued my loyalty and returned it with genuine care. And now her own son wants to erase her memory for the sake of convenience." The accusation hung in the air like an electric charge. King Charles stepped forward, his own anger now fully visible as he confronted this unprecedented challenge to his authority. The carefully maintained facade of royal dignity was cracking under the pressure of emotions that had been building for months since his accession to the throne. "You are completely out of line," the king said, his voice shaking with rage. "I will not stand here and listen to accusations about my relationship with my own mother from a servant who clearly doesn't understand his place in this household." The word servant hit James like a physical blow. After years of being treated as something approaching family by the Queen, after building relationships based on mutual respect and shared experiences, he was being reminded that in the eyes of the new regime, he was nothing more than hired help with no right to opinions or feelings about the family he had devoted his life to serving. The confrontation had reached a point where neither man could back down without losing face. James had already burned every bridge that connected him to his former life of quiet service, while King Charles felt his authority being challenged in a way that demanded decisive response. The stage was set for an escalation that would have consequences far beyond the fate of a single vintage vehicle. Around them, the staff watched in stunned silence as decades of carefully maintained royal protocol crumbled before their eyes. This was history in the making, but not the kind that anyone would want to remember or celebrate. The silence that followed King Charles's use of the word servant seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the distant sound of Highland wind whistling through the garage's open doors. James Mackenzie felt something fundamental shift inside him at that moment, as if the last threads connecting him to his former life of quiet loyalty had finally snapped completely. The man who had spent 23 years perfecting the art of invisible service was gone, replaced by someone who had nothing left to lose. A servant, James repeated slowly, tasting the word like bitter medicine. Yes, Your Majesty, I suppose that's exactly what I am. A servant who was foolish enough to believe that loyalty meant something more than blind obedience. A servant who thought that caring for your family gave me some small right to speak when I saw that family's legacy being trampled. King Charles stepped back slightly, perhaps sensing that his choice of words had pushed the confrontation into dangerous new territory. But there was no retreating now for either man. The gathered staff watched in fascinated horror as years of suppressed tensions exploded into the open, shattering every convention that governed royal relationships. James's voice took on a different quality now, calmer, but somehow more menacing than his earlier anger. You want to know what your mother told me during one of our last drives together, Your Majesty? She said she worried about what would happen to the things she loved after she was gone. Not the crown jewels or the state treasures, but the personal things that mattered to her as a woman rather than as a queen. The king's face darkened at this revelation of private royal conversations, but James was beyond caring about breaches of confidence. The normal rules no longer applied when the very foundation of those rules was being destroyed by royal indifference to the queen's memory. She specifically mentioned that Range Rover, James continued, his eyes never leaving the king's face. Said it was the one place where she could still be herself, where she could drive and think and remember what it felt like to be free. She made me promise to take care of it, to make sure it didn't just get thrown away like an old piece of furniture when she was gone. Mr. Hartwell tried once again to interrupt, clearly desperate to end this confrontation before it caused permanent damage to royal relationships. Sergeant Mackenzie, perhaps these private conversations should remain private. I'm sure His Majesty appreciates your dedication to the late Queen's memory, but... But what? James turned on Hartwell with sudden fury. But we should pretend that 23 years of service means nothing, but we should ignore a dying woman's wishes because they're inconvenient for the new administration. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, how long did you serve Her late Majesty? 2 years. And now you're going to lecture me about respecting her memory. Hartwell recoiled from the verbal assault, clearly unprepared for this level of insubordination from a member of the staff. His face flushed red as he struggled to maintain his administrative authority in the face of James's emotional onslaught. King Charles watched this exchange with growing anger, recognizing that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. The presence of other staff members made this public humiliation even more intolerable, and he could see that word of this confrontation would spread throughout the royal household like wildfire. Enough, the king said sharply, his voice cutting through the argument like a blade. Sergeant Mackenzie, you are clearly unfit for duty and will be relieved of your responsibilities immediately. Your behavior today has been completely unacceptable, and I will not tolerate such disrespect from anyone in my employ. The threat of dismissal, which should have brought James to his senses, instead seemed to liberate him completely. If his career was ending anyway, he might as well speak every truth that had been building up inside him for months of watching the new reign unfold. Unfit for duty? James laughed bitterly. Your Majesty, I've been unfit for duty since the day your mother died, and I watched everything she valued being swept aside in the name of modernization. You want to fire me? Go ahead. But before you do, let me tell you exactly what I think of your plans for that Range Rover. The king opened his mouth to order James's immediate removal, but the guard's next words stopped him cold. You're not taking it because you need another estate vehicle, James said with quiet intensity. You're taking it because it's the one thing of hers that still has life in it, still carries her presence. You want to drive the same roads she loved, sit in the same seat where she found peace, because somewhere deep down you know you'll never measure up to what she was. The accusation hit King Charles like a physical blow. The suggestion that he was somehow trying to steal his mother's essence through her possessions touched on insecurities that he had been struggling with since ascending the throne. The comparison to the late Queen's reign had been a constant source of pressure, and James's words struck at the heart of those anxieties. How dare you? the king whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "How dare you presume to understand my relationship with my mother or my motivations? You're a guard, nothing more, and you have absolutely no right to speak to me this way." James met the king's fury with a calm that surprised everyone present, including himself. Having finally spoken the words that had been burning inside him for months, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over his anger. "You're right, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "I'm just a guard, but I'm a guard who loved your mother in a way that was pure and uncomplicated by family politics or institutional pressures. I'm a guard who saw her cry when Prince Philip died, who witnessed her loneliness during the long Scottish evenings, who understood that beneath all the ceremony was a woman who just wanted to drive her Range Rover and feel free for a few hours." The raw emotion in James's voice seemed to affect everyone present, even King Charles. For a moment, the anger in the king's eyes was replaced by something that might have been uncertainty or even pain. But the moment passed quickly as his royal training reasserted itself. "Your emotional attachment to my mother is noted," the king said coldly, "but it doesn't give you the right to question my decisions or challenge my authority. You've made your feelings clear, and now you'll face the consequences." James nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable end of his career with surprising dignity. "I understand, Your Majesty, but before I go, I want you to know that every time you drive that Range Rover, you'll be sitting in a seat that still holds the shape of a woman who was infinitely better than either of us. And maybe, just maybe, that will remind you of what you're supposed to be protecting instead of what you're trying to change." The king's face went white with rage at this final insult, but before he could respond, James turned and began walking toward the garage exit. His military bearing remained perfect despite everything that had happened, and his steps were steady as he headed toward an uncertain future outside the royal service that had defined his adult life. "Sergeant Mackenzie," the king called after him, his voice sharp with authority. "You are dismissed from royal service effective immediately. Your access to the estate will be revoked within the hour, and you are not to speak to anyone about what happened here today." James paused at the garage door and turned back for one final look at the covered Range Rover that had started this entire confrontation. Then he faced the king one last time, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I'll honor that request, Your Majesty, just as I've honored every other request from your family for the past 23 years. But I want you to remember something. When you're driving alone in that Range Rover, asking yourself why you feel so empty despite having everything you thought you wanted, the answer won't be found in taking things that belong to someone better than you. It will be found in becoming worthy of the crown you inherited." With those words, James Mackenzie turned and walked out of the royal garage, leaving behind a stunned silence and a king who suddenly found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about leadership, legacy, and the weight of inherited power. The confrontation was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. In the space of less than an hour, 23 years of loyal service had ended in disgrace. A family's private grief had been exposed to scrutiny, and the new king had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations and insecurities. As the garage gradually emptied of witnesses, King Charles stood alone beside his mother's Range Rover, wondering if the price of claiming it would be worth the memories it would force him to confront every time he drove it.